My husband's funeral was supposed to be a day to honor the life we built together. Instead, my own children tore my dignity to shreds in front of everyone. Mom, you don't belong in the front row with the family. My oldest son, Ethan, whispered cold in my ear as guests filed into the solemn church in Chicago. You don't deserve to sit here. My daughter, Rachel, wouldn't even look at me. Porch. And my youngest, Tyler, just muttered under his breath, Dad built all of this. You were just riding his coattails. Standing beside my husband's casket, I felt completely like an outsider in my own family. The church smelled of lilies and polished oak. Victoria Hayes walked over, her heels clicking on the floor. She wore a high-end designer black coat and pearl earrings. Porch. Even in her 70s, she carried herself like she was the true matriarch of this family. She gently squeezed my arm. You must be exhausted, she said, every word dripping with fake sympathy. I'm holding up, I replied calmly. Victoria nodded, her eyes sweeping across the church. William would have wanted today to be dignified. Porch. She put a deliberate emphasis on the word dignified, making my stomach twist. Before I could reply, she leaned in closer. You know how emotional the kids are right now. Try not to upset them today. Upset them? I almost laughed out loud. My husband had passed away 3 days earlier from a massive heart attack at his office. Porch. In the hospital, I was the one holding his hand, listening to the harsh beeping of the heart monitor. I was the one curled up on a stiff plastic chair in the waiting room through the long night. And when the doctor gently told us there was nothing more they could do, I was the one who kissed his cold forehead. Yet somehow, everyone here was treating me like I was the problem. Porch. Victoria walked away without waiting for an answer. I watched her cross the room to Ethan and whisper something in his ear. Ethan's jaw instantly tightened. For years, that woman had been pouring poison into my children's ears, driving a wedge between us. I knew it in my heart, but I never had concrete proof. Porch. William knew it too, but he was naive enough to believe that time and family bond would heal everything. Give them time, Bella, he used to tell me late at night. One day they'll understand. One day. Looking at his casket, a sharp pain shot through my chest, forcing me to grip the edge of a nearby pew. Our final conversation played back in my head. Porch. He was lying in that hospital bed with an oxygen tube under his nose, looking frailer than I had ever seen him. I should have protected you better, he had whispered, his voice barely audible. At the time, I thought he meant protecting me from the heartbreak of losing him. I never imagined he meant protecting me from our own flesh and blood. Porch. As more guests took their seats, the organ at the back of the church began to play a low, somber processional. People nodded politely in my direction, but their eyes kept drifting toward Ethan, the future leader of Jones Construction. Or so they all thought. An elderly woman walked up to me carefully. Isabella, she said softly. William spoke about you all the time. He loved you so much. Porch. My throat tightened. Thank you. Before she could say anything else, Rachel stepped in and coldly cut her off. The front pews are reserved for immediate family. The woman looked embarrassed, whispered a quick apology, and hurried away. I looked at my daughter in disbelief. Rachel, was that really necessary? Rachel crossed her arms. We're trying to keep things organized. Porch. Besides, you've barely said a word to me since Dad died. Her expression hardened instantly, maybe because I'm tired of playing along. That felt like a physical slap to the face. Playing along with what? Playing along like you actually cared about everything Dad built. Air seemed to leave my lungs, but Rachel pressed on, lowering her voice into a bitter venom. Porch. You only lived comfortably because of him. Everything we have came from Dad. I stared at her face, my own daughter's face, desperately searching for a trace of the little girl who used to hold my hand when crossing the street. But she was gone. Or maybe she had vanished years ago, and I was only accepting it today. The organ music faded. Porch. The director announced the memorial service would begin in 5 minutes, and guests began finding their seats. Ethan walked toward us with his signature, controlling stride. Mom, he said in a tone that left no room for debate, Go sit in the back with Aunt Victoria." I blinked, thinking I had misheard. "What? The front row is for immediate family." Orch. Tyler stepped up holding a paper coffee cup, muttering casually, "Can we just not make a scene today?" In that moment, something deep inside me broke. There was no hysteria, no dramatic breakdown, just a quiet, complete tear deep inside my chest. I looked from one child to the next. Orch. These three people whom I had carried, protected, fed, comforted, and sacrificed everything for, now looked at me as if I wasn't even their mother anymore. Right then, the heavy double doors at the back of the church swung open. Every head in the room turned. Samuel Carter, William's head personal attorney and the executor of his estate, walked in holding a sealed brown envelope. His expression was calm, serious, and completely unwavering. When his eyes met mine, I saw something unexpected. Not pity, respect. He walked slowly down the center aisle, stopping right in front of my three children. Then, he spoke words that dropped the entire church into a dead silence. "Your father instructed me to hand-deliver this document right here." Samuel's voice echoed clearly under the vaulted ceiling. "Under one condition: if Isabella experienced any disrespect at his funeral." The silence in the church became suffocating. You could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning and the rustle of fabric as guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Somewhere near the back, a woman softly cleared her throat. No one spoke, no one dared to move. Samuel Carter stood in the aisle holding that sealed envelope, while my children stared at him like thieves caught red-handed. Ethan was the first to react, his brow furrowing. "Samuel, this isn't the time for legal matters. The service is about to start." Samuel didn't even blink. "Your father anticipated you would say that." Whispers began to ripple through the congregation. Rachel crossed her arms defensively. "What is that supposed to mean?" Samuel looked her straight in the eye. "It means your father put measures in place to protect Isabella in case she faced any mistreatment today." I saw Rachel's face turn slightly pale. Just slightly. Tyler let out a loud, mocking laugh from beside the front pew. "Oh, come on, nobody mistreated her." Hearing those cruel words, I almost let out a laugh myself. Nobody mistreated her? As if they hadn't spent the last hour systematically stripping away every remaining shred of my dignity. Samuel carefully adjusted his glasses, turned to me and spoke with striking gentleness. "Mrs. Jones, would you like to sit down?" That sudden moment of kindness almost broke me. I gave a quiet nod, but before I could take a step, Ethan blocked my way again. "Sam, with all due respect, my dad just passed away. Whatever that document is, it can wait until after the burial." Samuel's face hardened into ice. "No, it cannot wait." The sharpness in his voice stunned everyone, including me. I had known Samuel Carter for over 20 years. He was usually so composed he seemed almost emotionless. He handled billion-dollar corporate mergers without batting an eye. But right now, there was something else in his eyes, a sense of protection over me. Victoria suddenly stood up from her seat near the aisle. "This is completely out of line," she snapped. "William would never want a spectacle like this at his funeral." Samuel slowly turned toward her. "Actually, Victoria, those were William's exact instructions." Her lips pressed into a tight line. For the first time all morning, I caught a fleeting expression on her face. Fear. Nearby, the funeral director looked completely lost. A few prominent business figures exchanged awkward glances. One of William's old partners leaned over, covering his mouth to whisper something. The humiliation I had been enduring alone just minutes ago was now turning into a public undoing for my children, and they hated every second of it. For years, Victoria had positioned herself as the trustworthy, caring matriarch of the family. Whenever William was busy, she stepped in, and I chose to stay quiet. She attended the school events William missed. She went golfing with Ethan. She listened when Rachel went through heartbreaks. She took Tyler out drinking after his divorce. Slowly and carefully, she became the voice my children trusted most, and I let it happen because I was too exhausted to fight, foolishly believing that love would eventually prove itself. I was wrong. Love without the strength of truth just leaves room for poison to take root. Samuel carefully untied the string on the envelope. There was another reason William updated his will. Victoria gasped sharply. "Samuel, keep your mouth shut!" He was worried Isabella would be left isolated after he passed. A sharp pain hit my chest. He knew Victoria would push the children to push Isabella completely off the board and out of the family estate. Ethan's eyes widened slowly. "Aunt Victoria, was that really your plan?" No, her response was too fast, loaded with panic. Tyler stared at her with growing disgust. "But just yesterday, you told me you wanted me to run the daily operations instead of Ethan." Victoria stayed silent for a full second. For her, that was an eternity. Rachel looked at her in horror. "You've been driving us apart this whole time." "I was protecting you." Victoria suddenly lost control, shouting at Rachel. "Protecting you from your so-called mother." Her shout echoed off the sacred church ceiling. The remaining guests no longer bothered to hide their discomfort. This was no longer a private family disagreement. It was a complete public breakdown. I slowly stood up from beside William's casket. My legs trembled from sheer exhaustion, but I needed to speak. "Victoria," I called out softly. She whipped her head around and glared at me. For years, I had avoided direct conflict with her. I swallowed the sharp comments, ignored the passive-aggressive remarks, and endured the quiet cruelty at family dinners and Thanksgiving. But today, standing next to my husband's casket, something deep inside me shifted permanently. "You've hated me since the day William married me." Victoria held her arms tight against herself. "You isolated my brother from his real family." "No," I answered softly. "He chose me." That hard truth landed heavily between us. Victoria's eyes filled with deep resentment. "You took everything from me." I stared at her in shock. "What are you talking about?" Then suddenly I understood. Not everything, but enough. Before William met me, Victoria was the absolute center of his world. They had lost their parents when they were young. William put her through college, paid her bills, bought her first car, and even covered her full financial support through 2 divorces. Then, he married me. Slowly and naturally, William's focus shifted. The family dynamic changed. His life priorities moved. Victoria could never forgive that. "You always needed him to belong entirely to you," I murmured. Her silence confirmed it. Rachel covered her mouth in shock. "My God?" Victoria looked away. For the first time today, she stopped looking like the powerful, elegant matriarch and just looked like a bitter, lonely old woman trapped in her own resentment. Samuel glanced toward the church doors. "The Financial Crimes Unit at the Chicago Police Department has already received the internal audit report for Jones Construction," he said calmly. Victoria's head snapped back. "You reported me?" William left instructions to initiate legal proceedings if the missing funds weren't voluntarily returned. Tyler blinked rapidly. Dad was actually going to press charges against his own sister? Samuel's expression dimmed slightly. "Making that decision caused your father immense pain." "Of course it did. Because despite everything, William still loved his sister. That was his fatal weakness. He loved deeply, but he avoided conflict at all costs. It was that flaw that nearly destroyed our family." Victoria grabbed her designer bag with trembling hands. "This family is rotten to the core." "You deserve to tear each other apart." She spat through clenched teeth, turning and walking swiftly toward the church doors. No one stopped her. No one went after her. The heavy wooden doors shut loudly behind her, the sound ringing through the church like the final drop of a gavel. For the next few seconds, nobody moved. Finally, Tyler broke the silence. "I don't even know what we are anymore." I didn't either. But looking at my 3 children standing by their father's casket, broken, ashamed, and lost, I realized something profound. After all these years, the lies were finally falling away, and this might be the only remaining chance for our family to save itself. The crowd didn't fully disperse until after sunset. Outside, a thick layer of white snow had accumulated, muffling the sound of Chicago's evening traffic like a soft blanket and settling the city into a strange quiet. Inside me, though, everything was churning. My husband was gone. My children had humiliated me. Their most trusted aunt had taken massive amounts from the company, and all of this had been brewing under a calm surface for decades. Porch. The funeral director walked softly over to Samuel near the altar. "We need to transfer Mr. Jones to the cemetery soon," he reminded him gently. Samuel nodded. "Please give the family a few more minutes." The family. The word felt fragile, its edges sharp and fractured. I sat near William's casket, while Ethan stood by the front pew, staring intently at the floor. Porch. Rachel stood beside him without a word, clutching a crumpled tissue in her hands. Tyler paced anxiously by the window, clearly on the verge of breaking down. The four of us didn't know how to speak to one another anymore. Finally, Samuel broke the silence. "William instructed me to share one last thing with you tonight." All three kids looked up immediately. Ethan frowned slightly. "There's more?" Porch. Samuel gave a single nod. "Yes." The look on his face made my stomach twist again. He reopened his briefcase and pulled out a heavy folder stamped with the legal seal of Jones Construction. "This contains the official conditions attached to William's estate distribution." Rachel caught her breath softly. "Conditions?" Samuel placed the folder carefully on the front pew. "Porch. Your father did not leave an unconditional inheritance." Tyler let out a dry, bitter laugh. "Of course he didn't." Ethan slowly drew himself up. "What are you trying to say, Sam?" Samuel crossed his hands calmly in front of him. "I mean, William firmly believed that giving you unlimited wealth without accountability would completely ruin this family." The room fell dead silent again. Porch. Then Samuel opened the folder. Under the revised trust structure, Isabella receives absolute controlling interest and authority over Jones Construction, the family estate in Lake Forest, all investment holdings, and the family trust funds. Even hearing it out loud, it felt completely unreal to me. I had never chased control. I didn't care about titles or company shares. Porch. I only wanted peace in my family. But William must have known. If I didn't hold the means to protect myself, this home would never know peace. Samuel continued. "The children remain beneficiaries of the trust fund." Ethan let out a quiet sigh of relief, but Samuel wasn't finished. "However," he added calmly, "their access to trust distributions and inheritance is conditional." Porch. Tyler stopped pacing instantly. "Conditional on what?" Samuel looked directly at the three of them. "Fulfilling your father's final instructions." Rachel shook her head, lost. "What instructions?" Samuel pulled 3 separate envelopes from the folder, one for each of them. Seeing William's familiar handwriting again made my heart ache sharply. Samuel handed an envelope to each of my children. Porch. Your father wanted each of you to face your own truth before gaining any financial control. No one opened their envelope right away. They just stared at the paper in their hands as if touching it would turn it into an unavoidable reality. Finally, Ethan spoke up. "And if we refuse?" Samuel answered without hesitation. "Porch. Then your right to inherit is completely revoked, and all funds transfer into the Jones Family Charitable Foundation, managed by Isabella." Tyler muttered a curse under his breath. Rachel looked like she was on the verge of tears again. "This feels like a punishment." "No," Samuel said softly. "William saw it as a second chance." I closed my eyes for a moment. Porch. That sounded so much like my husband. Even at the very end of his life, he stubbornly believed people could change. Samuel gestured toward the envelopes. "You should read them." Ethan was the first to open his. His eyes scanned the letter quickly, his expression instantly stiffening. Rachel opened hers next, her hands visibly trembling. Porch. Tyler hesitated the longest, finally tearing his open with a look of defeat. Aside from the rustle of paper, the church was dead quiet. Ethan spoke first, his voice raspy. "He wants me to work at the company from the ground level for 6 months, reporting directly to Mom." Samuel nodded. "During that time, all executive privileges and decision-making power are revoked." Ethan froze. George, he's demoting me? No, Samuel corrected him. He's asking you to learn humility. Rachel looked down at her letter. He wants me to volunteer 3 days a week at the family foundation. Her voice choked slightly. He said, I need to learn empathy before I can access my trust payouts. On the other side of the room, Tyler let out a bitter, painful laugh. George. Oh, mine is even better. He held up his paper. Dad wants me in a rehabilitation center. Tyler swallowed hard with difficulty. Must maintain 12 months of complete sobriety before receiving a single cent. As he read the last line, his voice cracked completely. Suddenly, a harsh reality hit me. William didn't write these conditions out of anger. George. He wrote them out of love. A desperate kind of love. It was the kind of love that surfaces when parents realize their time is up, and the truth can no longer be hidden. Ethan looked at Samuel. When exactly did Dad write all of this? After his second hospital stay. My heart squeezed tightly. That was right when William learned his heart condition was irreversible. George. Rachel wiped away her tears again. He knew he was dying. Samuel nodded slowly. Yes, that word settled over all of us like a new layer of sorrow. For a long time, no one said anything. Suddenly, Tyler looked over at me, not looking through me but actually meeting my eyes. Did you know about any of this beforehand? I shook my head. No, that was the honest truth. George. William had never shown me the final details of his will. He had simply held my hand tightly one late night in the hospital, whispering something I only fully understood today. I have to make sure they can't tear you down after I'm gone. At the time, I thought he was disoriented from the medication. Now I finally understood how terrified he must have been. Ethan slowly sat down on the front pew. George, I was a complete jerk to you today. The raw honesty in his voice caught me off guard. Rachel started crying quietly again. Tyler turned away, unable to look me in the eye. For the first time since William passed, I saw something in my children I had never seen before. Shame. Genuine shame. George. Not because their inheritance was at risk, but because the truth had finally forced them to face a very ugly side of themselves. Samuel carefully closed the estate folder. Finally, there is one joint condition that applies to all three of you. Ethan looked entirely drained. What else? Samuel's expression softened slightly. George, your father requires the three of you to attend a private family meeting next Friday. Rachel frowned. With who? With Isabella. The room was quiet enough to hear a pin drop. Samuel continued gently. William believed that reconciliation requires absolute honesty, and none of you have been willing to speak what's truly in your hearts. Tyler let out a weak chuckle. George. So Dad set up family therapy for us from beyond the grave? A quiet laugh suddenly slipped out of my mouth, short, broken, but completely genuine. Everyone looked at me in surprise, and I quickly covered my mouth in embarrassment. Then, through her tears, Rachel let out a soft laugh too. The sound startled us all because it felt so unfamiliar, a long-lost human warmth breaking through. George. For a fleeting second, the suffocating tension cracked open, allowing the grief to finally breathe. Then, Ethan softly asked the question everyone was terrified to bring up. What if Mom never forgives us? The laughter vanished instantly. 3 pairs of eyes turned toward me, waiting, hoping, fearing. George. I looked closely at my children, the ones I had stayed up with through high fevers, guided through heartbreaks, and watched fall and get back up. The same children who had just inflicted the deepest, most agonizing pain on me. And suddenly, a heartbreaking truth struck me. They were still my children, no matter how deeply they had wounded me. George. I swallowed the bitterness in my throat and murmured softly, to be honest, I really don't know right now. That honest answer stung every one of us. But maybe truth was the only thing left that could save this family. Outside, the Chicago snow kept falling. Inside, beside my husband's casket, the family William had spent a lifetime trying to protect sat together in painful silence. George. Not healed, not forgiven, but finally, facing the truth. 2 days later, under a gray winter sky, William was laid to rest. The cemetery overlooking Lake Michigan was dead silent, save for the howling wind and the crunch of black dress shoes on packed snow. I stood beside his grave, clutching a white lily, listening as the pastor finished the final prayers. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. Porch. 43 years of marriage reduced to a casket slowly lowering into the cold earth. Strangely, despite the painful scene at the funeral, I felt more numb than angry right now. Maybe when heavy grief first sets in, there's just no room left in your heart for anything else. My children stood close by. They weren't packed together, but they were much closer than before. Porch. Ethan no longer avoided my gaze. Rachel stood so near that our coats brushed whenever the wind shifted. And Tyler kept his hands stuffed in his pockets, remaining unusually sober and painfully silent. They hadn't offered a formal apology yet. At least not a complete one. But something had shifted. That arrogant entitlement was gone, replaced by an uneasy posture and deep remorse. Porch. After the burial, most of the guests left quickly due to the biting cold. Samuel stayed until the end, squeezed my shoulder gently, and turned toward his car. "I'll see you Friday," he said softly. I nodded. The family meeting. William's final condition. Just thinking about it left me exhausted. Soon, it was just the four of us standing before the gravestone. Porch. My children and me, a family that no longer knew how to exist together. Rachel spoke first. "Mom." Her voice trembled slightly. I looked at her. "We found more documents last night." My stomach tightened instantly. "What documents?" Ethan answered this time. "Dad left individual financial files for each of us." Of course he did. Porch. William had spent his entire life in the business world. He trusted evidence, not allegations or emotional pleas. He only believed in facts. Tyler rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. There were things in my file that even I had forgotten about. None of us moved. Snowflakes drifted down onto William's gravestone. Finally, Ethan broke the silence again. There was a copy of a check inside. Porch. I frowned slightly. "What check?" His jaw muscles tightened. "A cashier's check you wrote 20 years ago." That memory hit me like a flash. Gambling debts. Dangerous people making threats against his life. A desperate phone call at 2 a.m. Ethan swallowed with difficulty. "You pulled out $240,000 to settle that debt for me." Porch. I shifted my gaze toward the frozen lake. "Yes. Why?" The question sounded almost childish. "Why did you do that?" "Because you were my son. Because when children are terrified, mothers make sacrifices that defy logic. Because love doesn't always operate on reason." "Because you were terrified," I answered calmly. Ethan stared at me. "You should have told Dad. I promised you I wouldn't." Porch. His eyes widened. "You were protecting me from his anger. I was protecting you from humiliation." The silence that followed was agonizing. Then, Ethan spoke words I never imagined I would hear from him. "I didn't deserve that kind of loyalty from you." A sharp ache pierced through my chest, because beneath all of Ethan's anger, there had always been a deep sense of shame. Porch. Even as a child. Especially then. William had been exceptionally demanding of him growing up, raising him to take over the company. Straight A's, leadership, absolute perfection. Ethan spent his whole life terrified of disappointing his father, and somewhere along the way, he began to resent the one person who loved him unconditionally. He resented me. Porch. Rachel suddenly handed me a folded piece of paper with trembling hands. "What is this?" I asked softly. She looked like she was on the verge of breaking down again. "My medical bills." I slowly unfolded the paper. The total amount was highlighted in yellow, $87,430, paid in full. Right below the authorization line was my signature. Rachel's voice cracked. "Porch. I always thought insurance covered that. That night remains crystal clear in my mind." She was 19 when she lost the baby, a sudden miscarriage. Blood, panic, and afterward, she couldn't stop trembling, weeping in total despair that her life was over. William was in Denver at the time, closing a major construction merger. Porch. Rachel begged me not to tell him right away because she couldn't bear the thought of seeing disappointment in her father's eyes. So, I handled everything on my own. The hospital, the recovery, the overwhelming medical bills. and her completely shattered spirit. I sold some of my shares, I admitted softly. Rachel instantly covered her mouth. You sold your own personal investments. To pay my bills? Tears spilled over, running down her cheeks. And I treated you like a useless freeloading outsider. I looked at my daughter standing before her father's grave. Suddenly, I didn't see a cruel woman anymore. I saw a lost little girl. All these years, she had listened to the wrong voice. Victoria's voice, always Victoria. Porch. Tyler spoke up beside me, his voice sounding raspy and heavy with shame. That's not all. He pulled a photograph from his coat pocket. I recognized it instantly. It was my gold bracelet. The legacy my mother left me before she passed. To bail Tyler out of his second major drunk driving charge, to keep his entire career from being ruined, I pawned it. Porch. You even kept the pawn shop receipt, Tyler choked out. I closed my eyes briefly. I never thought he would see that. I always intended to buy it back one day, I admitted gently. Tyler's emotional wall crumbled entirely. My God. He turned away, pressing his hand firmly over his eyes. Porch. Seeing this broke my heart, not because I wanted them to suffer, but because I finally understood a brutally hard truth. My children honestly didn't know. Not a single one of them knew. All these years, I thought they were simply ignoring my sacrifices. But the truth was far sadder. They had never seen them at all. Porch. Because I hid everything too well, because William chose to remain silent, and because Victoria filled those silent gaps with poison. Ethan turned toward his father's gravestone. Dad knew all of this. Yes. And he never stopped us from turning on you. The pain in his voice mirrored my own thoughts. I wrapped my coat tighter against the bitter cold. Porch. Your father believed the best way to protect this family was to maintain a peaceful surface. Rachel shook her head slowly. He should have stood up for you. The raw honesty in that statement caught me off guard. I looked at her closely. Yes, I echoed softly. He should have. No one spoke after that because there was nothing left to pretend. Porch. Eventually, Tyler sat down heavily on a nearby bench. I can't stop replaying what I said to you at the church. I stayed silent. His voice was painfully raspy. Dad built all of this. You were just riding his coattails. The shame on his face looked almost physically suffocating. I can't believe I said that to you. I looked down at the snow covering William's grave. Porch. The truth was, I could believe it. Once people stop seeing a person's sacrifices, cruelty becomes effortless, especially toward a mother. That is how we slowly become invisible. Dinner automatically appears on the table, bills are quietly paid, trouble is silently resolved. Eventually, no one bothers to ask who is actually carrying the weight. Rachel sat down beside Tyler. We were awful to you. Porch. My maternal instinct almost made me blurt out. No, you weren't. It's okay, we are so conditioned to soften the blow, to shield our children from guilt even when they are grown adults. But William was gone, and perhaps that exact instinct, protecting everyone from the truth, was what broke our family in the first place. So this time, for the first time in decades, I chose the truth. Porch. Yes, I said calmly, you were awful. Those words hit all three of them hard. Ethan dropped his eyes immediately. Rachel wept silently, and Tyler looked almost sick to his stomach, but I kept going. For a very long time, you made me feel like an intruder in my own home. The cold wind whistled softly between the gravestones. I kept waiting. Porch. I waited for any of you after your father passed to ask a simple question. Mom, are you okay? No one answered. Not one of you did. Rachel broke down first. I'm so sorry, she sobbed. A few words felt far too small for decades of harm, not meaningless, just small. I took one last look at William's gravestone and turned toward the path leading out of the cemetery. Porch. I loved your father deeply, I said softly, and I loved you enough to stay silent for a long time. I turned back to face my children, but silence always carries a heavy price. As I walked toward the car, none of them followed immediately. In a way, it felt appropriate. This week, we weren't just burying grief. We were burying long-standing lies, and the truth was finally surfacing. Porch. Truth always hurts deeply before it can begin to heal. 3 days after the burial, Victoria Hayes attempted to reclaim control. By then, whispers about the Jones family were quietly circulating through Chicago's business circles. It wasn't the whole story, but it was enough to spark rumors. People knew William Jones had altered his estate plan right before his passing, that family conflict had erupted at the funeral, and that massive funds were missing from Jones' construction. I despised the gossip. William spent his life building the company's reputation, and now his death was becoming casual talk at cocktail parties and executive lunches. But the public embarrassment wasn't the worst part. It was the growing realization of how deeply the damage ran behind closed doors. That Thursday morning, I walked into the Jones construction headquarters for the first time since the funeral. The steel and glass skyscraper towered over downtown Chicago, representing 30 years of sweat and sacrifice, our shared sacrifice. I sat in the driver's seat for nearly 10 minutes before forcing myself to walk through the lobby doors. The moment I stepped inside, conversations stopped dead. Employees looked over cautiously, some with sympathy, others with visible nervousness. Diane, a senior receptionist, immediately walked out from behind her desk and pulled me into a tight hug. "I am so sorry about William," she whispered. Emotion blocked my throat. "Thank you, Diane." Then she lowered her voice. "Be careful up there." My stomach tightened. "Why?" She hesitated. "Victoria is already upstairs, of course she was." Forcing down my pounding heart, I took the elevator straight to the executive floor. As the doors opened, chaotic arguing spilled out into the hallway from the main conference room. I recognized Ethan's voice first. "No, absolutely not." Then Victoria, "You have no idea how corporate operations actually work." I walked toward the heavy, half-open boardroom doors. Inside, key board members sat stiffly around the long walnut table. Ethan stood at one end, furious. Rachel sat near the window, looking physically drained. Tyler stood against the wall with his arms crossed, and right in the center of the storm stood Victoria Hayes. The moment she saw me, her expression darkened into ice. "Ah," she sneered. The widow finally decided to show up. The room fell quiet. I noticed files scattered across the table. Financial summaries, audit reports, legal notices. Samuel stood calmly by the projection screen. "Isabella, please take a seat," he said gently. Victoria let out a harsh laugh. "Oh, right. Let's pretend she can actually read corporate financial statements." A wire snapped inside Ethan. "Enough!" Every head turned toward him. Victoria blinked. "What did you say?" I said enough. Ethan's voice held a dangerous calm, the exact tone William used right before dismantling an opponent at the negotiating table. For years, Ethan had backed Victoria without question. Now, he looked at her like she was a complete stranger. "You've been lying to us this whole time." Victoria crossed her arms. "I was protecting this family." "No," Rachel countered weakly. "You were manipulating us." Victoria scoffed. "You're just emotional because your father passed." Samuel calmly pressed a button on his remote. A massive spreadsheet appeared on the wall screen behind him, filled with transaction logs, dates, transfer numbers, and one striking figure. $6 million. Silence settled over the room once more. Samuel pointed to highlighted records. Over the past 7 years, these funds were secretly diverted into Hawthorne Strategic Holdings. Victoria rolled her eyes immediately. "We've already discussed this." "No," Samuel corrected her gently. "Now we are discussing criminal exposure." The word criminal shifted the air in the room completely. One board member shifted uncomfortably, while another silently took off his glasses. Victoria's face hardened into stone. "You can't prove intent." Samuel opened another file. "Actually, we can." He passed copies around the table. I looked down at the paper in front of me. Emails, dozens of them, between Victoria and her partner, detailing exactly how to move corporate funds through fake consulting agreements. My chest throbbed with a sharp pain. "My God!" Rachel covered her mouth. Tyler muttered a low curse, and Ethan looked visibly sick. Victoria tried to regain control. Those were standard legal tax minimization strategies. No, Samuel said flatly. That is theft. That direct characterization stunned the room. Victoria turned on me abruptly. You must be thrilled right now, aren't you? The accusation caught me completely off guard. Thrilled? About what? Thrilled to watch this family crumble, watching us tear each other apart. I stared at her in disbelief. You started this yourself. No, she suddenly shouted. You did. The day you took William away from me, this whole mess began. The air in the room froze. There it was. Finally. 40 years of buried resentment and truth, completely exposed. Victoria's eyes burned with wild bitterness. He changed after he married you. I swallowed hard. He just grew up. No, she screamed. He didn't need me anymore. A suffocating silence filled the room. Even Samuel didn't interrupt because everyone finally understood. This was never truly about money. Money was just a weapon used for retaliation. The real wound was jealousy, possessiveness, and 4 decades of buried resentment. Victoria looked around desperately. Do you all think she's innocent? Ask her where she was when William nearly worked himself to death building this company. Before anyone else could speak, I answered calmly, I was working. Her face twisted. Oh, please. I worked 2 jobs while raising 3 children, I said steadily. You were the one sitting back, benefiting from everything. A soft, tired laugh escaped my lips. Not out of amusement, but because I was simply too exhausted to defend my existence anymore. Yes, I enjoyed the life my husband and I built together. Victoria opened her mouth to argue, but Ethan cut her off sharply. Dad left the company to Mom because he trusted her. That statement hit harder than any screaming match because Ethan finally believed it in his heart. Victoria looked stunned. You can't seriously support this absurd decision. Ethan's face was set in stone. I supported you for years while you fed us poison to make us resent our own mother. Rachel lowered her head and Tyler looked away in shame. The weight of remorse in the room was almost unbearable. Samuel neatly gathered his remaining files. We have one final item to resolve. Victoria let out a dramatic sigh. Now what? Samuel turned to the board members. William instructed that upon confirmation of financial misconduct, Victoria Hayes is to be removed immediately from all advisory roles within Jones Construction. One board member nodded right away. Another silently raised his hand. All in favor, please raise your hand. Every single hand raised slowly around the table, except Victoria's. Even Ethan raised his hand. Victoria looked around the table in sheer disbelief. You are all making a massive mistake. No one responded, because deep down, everyone knew the real mistake had been going on for far too long. 15 minutes later, security arrived. I never imagined I would see the day Victoria Hayes was escorted out of the building William spent his life building. But as she gathered her handbag, she paused beside me for a brief moment. For a fleeting second, the rage vanished from her face, leaving behind only profound loneliness. Do you think they love you now? She whispered bitterly. The question stung more than I expected, because a quiet corner of my heart still feared the answer. Victoria offered a bitter, cold smile. They will fail you again. Then she walked away without looking back. After the elevator doors closed behind her, a long silence settled over the boardroom. Tyler dropped heavily into a chair, rubbing his face with both hands. I feel sick. Rachel leaned against the window, crying softly. Ethan stared intently at the financial reports spread across the table, then slowly turned to look at me. The doubt and resentment in his eyes were gone, replaced by deep shame. And perhaps a trace of respect. I don't know how to fix any of this, he admitted softly. I didn't know either. But for the first time in decades, my children were finally asking the right questions. Not who gets what or who controls the company, but how a family falls apart, and whether it can ever be put back together. The family meeting was set for Friday evening. William had arranged it weeks before he passed. Of course he had. Even near the end, my husband attempted to keep us tied together using tight schedules, directives, and carefully laid plans. Samuel booked a private conference room on the top floor of the Jones construction building, overlooking the Chicago skyline. Porch. White snow blanketed the city below, turning the streets into glowing ribbons under the traffic lights. The room smelled faintly of coffee and leather, the exact place where William once closed multi-million-dollar deals. Now it held something far more fragile than a contract: his family. I arrived last. Porch. When the elevator doors opened, my 3 children were already sitting at the long boardroom table, waiting in silence. Ethan stood by the window, wearing a dark wool sweater instead of his usual tailored suit. Rachel looked exhausted, her eyes swollen from days of crying. Tyler slouched in his chair, nervously squeezing a paper coffee cup. Samuel gave me a gentle nod. "Take your time." Porch. I walked to the head of the table, William's old seat, and sat down slowly. The moment I realized where I was sitting, I almost wanted to run. I didn't want his seat, I just wanted my husband back. For nearly a minute, no one spoke. The silence felt like a massive divide between us. Finally, Samuel slid a small envelope across the table toward me. "Porch. William asked that you read this privately before the discussion begins." My fingers trembled slightly as I opened it. Inside was William's familiar, messy handwriting. "Bella, if you are sitting in this room, it means I am gone, and our children have finally heard the truth I should have told them years ago. I know you are exhausted. Porch, I know you want to leave all of this behind, but please don't. At least not yet. They still need you, even if they don't realize it themselves. Whether it still means anything or not, I need to say this. I am sorry. I am so sorry I left you to carry this family alone for so long. Forever yours. William." Porch. I stared at the note until tears blurred my vision, then carefully folded it back up. During those quiet moments while I gathered myself, no one interrupted. When I finally looked up, I noticed the shift in my children's eyes. There was no defensiveness, no blame, just a cautious uncertainty, as if they no longer knew how to reach me. Samuel quietly stood up. "Porch, I'll be waiting outside." He walked out of the room. The moment the door closed, tension filled the air. No attorneys, no legal documents, just us, raw, broken, and real. Tyler was the first to break the ice. "I hate this room." A faint laugh almost escaped me. "Your father practically lived here." "I know," Tyler muttered. "That's why I hate it." Silence returned. Porch. Then, Ethan slowly sat down across from me. "I've spent the whole week reading through the files Dad left." I nodded slightly. "I read them too." He swallowed hard. There was so much more than I expected. Of course there was. Near the end of his life, William documented everything almost obsessively, perhaps fearing that once he was gone, no one would believe the truth. Porch. Rachel looked down at the table. "I found old emails between you and Dad from the early years." My chest tightened slightly. "What emails?" "From when the business was just starting," she said, her voice shaking. "You used to help him draft project bids late at night after your evening shifts." Despite the heavy atmosphere, a faint, bittersweet smile touched my lips. "Your father hated paperwork." Porch. Rachel let out a tearful, broken laugh. "He wrote in an email that he was going to build you a beachfront house one day." I looked away quickly. I had forgotten about that email, or maybe I had buried it deep down because remembering it now hurt too much. "He never built that beachfront house," Tyler said softly. "No," I murmured, "but he kept trying." Porch. That was William. Always trying, even when exhausted, even through failures, even when he should have slowed down years ago. Ethan suddenly leaned forward. "Mom, why didn't you ever fight back?" The question hung heavily in the room. I looked at him closely. "What do you mean? You let us believe those awful lies about you for years. Why didn't you defend yourself?" Porch. Rachel began weeping quietly again, while Tyler stared intently at the floor. I thought for a long time before answering because I had stubbornly believed that love would eventually overcome misunderstanding. Even though no one moved, the air felt completely drained from the room. "It didn't," Ethan said quietly. "No," I admitted calmly. "It didn't." That honest realization stung every one of us. Porch. Tyler pushed his coffee cup away in frustration. I can't stop hearing what I said at the funeral. I closed my eyes briefly. I couldn't either. Dad built all of this. You were just riding his coattails. Tyler's voice cracked completely as he repeated it. I sounded like a complete monster. You were misled, I said softly. No. Tyler shook his head firmly. I sounded cruel and cold. Orch. Quiet returned to the room. Then Ethan looked me straight in the eye. We owe you an apology. Part of me instinctively wanted to interrupt, to protect him from the weight of his own shame. That was my old maternal instinct. But another part of me, the tired and bruised soul, needed him to say it out loud. I needed all of them to say it. Rachel wiped her tears with trembling hands. Orch. I treated you like an outsider in this family. You did make me feel like one, I admitted softly. Those words visibly pained her. But it was necessary, not for revenge, but because truth mattered, especially after so many years of silence. Ethan lowered his gaze. I judged you my whole life without ever asking what you actually sacrificed. Tyler let out a bitter laugh. All of us did. Orch. I looked at my 3 children sitting around the long table where William used to give orders with absolute confidence. 3 adults carrying heavy guilt, 3 wounded people realizing that the person they looked down on was the one who loved them most. Strangely, I felt no sense of victory, only an overwhelming weariness. Orch. Rachel finally asked the question they were all afraid to bring up. Can you ever forgive us? No one breathed. Outside, Chicago's neon lights flickered and silence stretched endlessly through the room. I looked at each of them closely, my children, the source of my deepest heartbreak, my entire life. Then, swallowing decades of pain, I gave them the absolute truth. I don't know. Orch. Rachel broke down crying instantly. Tyler covered his face, and Ethan looked like he had been struck. But I kept speaking. You humiliated me publicly at your father's funeral. My voice began to tremble. While the man who loved me lay in a casket beside us, you looked at me like I was worthless. Tears blurred my vision. That week, I buried my husband. The room was painfully still. Orch. To be honest, I choked out. I feel like I lost my children long before I lost William. Rachel was weeping openly now. Tyler stared at me in despair, and Ethan looked completely heartbroken. For the first time in decades, no one interrupted my pain, no one minimized my feelings, and no one told me to stay quiet for the sake of family harmony. Orch. In a way, the silence felt necessary, almost sacred. Ethan slowly stood up and walked around the long table toward me. I tensed up instinctively, but he didn't say a word. Instead, he dropped to one knee beside my chair, just like he used to as a little boy seeking comfort after a nightmare. I'm so sorry, Mom, he sobbed, his voice completely broken. Orch. It was genuine grief, raw, painful, and years overdue. Rachel followed immediately, breaking down beside my chair, while Tyler stood stiffly for a moment before finally coming over too. As my 3 children wept around me in that top-floor Chicago conference room, a hard reality became clear. Forgiveness couldn't happen in an instant, and love doesn't heal that quickly. Orch. But perhaps this was the first truly honest moment our family had shared in years. And honesty, even through deep pain, was finally pulling us back together. The following weeks felt delicate, like walking across thin ice where you could constantly hear cracks beneath your feet. Nothing was instantly fixed, and nothing felt normal, but something had fundamentally shifted. Orch. The cold resentment was gone, replaced by awkwardness, guilt, and careful effort. For the first time in years, my children began reaching out on their own, not for financial support or appearances, but simply for me. Rachel started visiting every Sunday afternoon. Orch. At first, she brought unnecessary gifts, expensive flowers, fancy pastries from downtown bakeries, as if those offerings could close years of distance. They couldn't, but I understood what she was trying to say. One snowy Sunday, while I was making tea in the kitchen, she stood nearby, looking unsure of herself. You're still using those same mugs, she said softly. Orch. I glanced at the faded blue ceramic mug in the cabinet. William had bought it nearly 30 years ago during our first trip to Michigan. We always liked these mugs, I answered gently. Rachel nodded. After a long silence, she said something that nearly brought me to tears. I can't remember the last time I just sat in the kitchen and talked with you. Porch. The sadness in her voice was real, because I couldn't remember either. Recent years had been filled with hurried holiday meals, polite small talk, and emotional distance hidden behind polite smiles. Back then, they treated me like background furniture rather than a mother. I carefully handed her a mug of tea. You were busy building your own life. Rachel's eyes welled up instantly. Porch. That's no excuse. It wasn't, but hearing her acknowledge it meant more than she realized. 3 days after our family meeting, Tyler checked into a rehabilitation facility. I hadn't expected him to go willingly. I honestly thought he would slip away as he usually did when life became overwhelming. But William's letter hit him deeper than anyone expected, especially the closing lines. Porch. Samuel later showed me that section privately. Tyler, you inherited my stubbornness and your mother's heart. The former saved your life more than once, but the latter nearly broke you. If you want to find real peace, stop running from who you truly are. Love, Dad. Tyler called me from the facility around 8 every evening. Porch. At first, the calls were brief and awkward, but gradually the distance between us began to thaw. During his 3rd week of treatment, he asked a question I didn't see coming. Mom, did you really pawn Grandma's bracelet back then to help me out? I sat on the couch holding the phone close. Yes, I did. Silence followed, then a quiet murmur. I wish you hadn't. Porch. The pain in his voice hit me immediately. Why? Because every time I think about it, I hate myself for it. Tears blurred my eyes. Tyler. I treated you like you didn't matter, his voice shook, while you were literally sacrificing a part of your life to save mine. We stayed quiet for several seconds before I answered truthfully. You're my son. That was never a calculation for me. Porch. He wept quietly on the other end of the line. For the first time since he was a young boy, I heard vulnerability in his voice instead of anger. Ethan changed the slowest. That didn't surprise me. He had spent his whole life believing control equaled security. Successful people rarely admit fault easily, especially a man raised by a father like William. Yet remorse was eating away at him. Porch. I could see it every time he came to the office. Per William's conditions, Ethan was working directly under my supervision at Jones Construction. Initially, that arrangement clearly bruised his ego, not because he doubted my capabilities, but because it forced him to face how deeply he had misunderstood me. Our early meetings were stiflingly formal. Mrs. Jones. Mr. Jones. Porch, like complete strangers. Then, about a month after the funeral, Ethan brought a worn leather binder into my office. I found this in Dad's storage room. I looked up from my desk. The binder held dozens of old accounting ledgers. My ledgers, filled with handwritten records of the company's early finances, loans, payroll details, debt negotiations, and personal sacrifices. Porch. Ethan carefully turned a page. You recorded every expense by hand back when we couldn't afford an accountant. His eyes tracked the faded ink down the page, stopping abruptly. What's this? I leaned closer to look. It was a marginal note next to a payroll entry. Sold personal jewelry. Covered emergency labor shortfall. My stomach tightened as the memory returned. Porch. A major client had delayed payment unexpectedly, and William feared payroll would bounce right before Christmas. Several workers were depending on that money for their families, so the next morning, I quietly pawned my jewelry. Ethan stared at the ledger in disbelief. You sold your personal belongings to pay the crew? I nodded slightly. The company desperately needed cash flow at the time. Porch. He sat down heavily in the chair across from my desk. My whole life, I thought Dad built this company entirely on his own. I looked at him gently. Your father carried immense pressure, Ethan. So did you. The realization in his eyes looked almost physically painful. Then, like a quiet confession, he admitted, I think I chose to ignore you because it was easier. Porch. The honesty caught me off guard. What do you mean? He looked down at the ledger. Dad was a larger-than-life figure, strong, respected, highly visible. Everyone talked about him. He swallowed hard. And you were quiet. I remained silent, and quiet people are easy to overlook. Arch. Those words landed heavily on my heart, because it was true, especially for mothers, wives, and women who spend decades quietly holding a family together from behind the scenes. Ethan rubbed his face with both hands. I grew up into a man who only respected visible sacrifices. Tears gathered in my eyes. Arch. Somewhere along the way, we had made a mistake, letting our children believe that success mattered more than kindness, that visible credit mattered more than emotional labor, and that status mattered more than loyalty. Now, all of us were paying for that mistake. That same evening, Samuel invited the whole family back to the executive conference room. Arch. There is one final item William wanted you all to see, he explained calmly. The room was dim when we arrived, lit mostly by the soft glow of the projection screen. This time, Rachel sat beside me without hesitation. Tyler, home on an approved weekend visit from his program, looked healthier than he had in years. Ethan stood quietly by the window. Arch. Samuel plugged a drive into the projector, looking at us thoughtfully. William recorded this video 12 days before he passed. I held my breath. The screen flickered to life, and suddenly my husband appeared. He looked older, paler and frailer than I remembered, but it was unmistakably William. The air in the room froze. Even Tyler stopped moving. Arch. William adjusted his position on the hospital bed, looking straight into the camera, almost as if he were staring right at us through the screen. When he spoke, his voice carried an emotion I hadn't heard in years. If you're watching this, he said quietly, it means I ran out of time to fix what I broke with my own hands. Arch. A dead silence fell over the conference room. Not just an ordinary quiet, but that suffocating stillness that takes over when grief suddenly becomes real all over again. William's face filled the whole projection screen. Under the harsh hospital lights, he looked ghost white, and the oxygen tube under his nose made him look heart-wrenchingly fragile. Arch. Mentally, I still wasn't ready to see him like that. For 43 years, my husband was the strongest man in every room he walked into. Now, he looked exhausted, human, and close to the end. As the video played, Rachel instinctively grabbed my hand. William gave a weak smile to the camera. I probably argued with Samuel about filming this, he said softly. I always hated getting emotional. Arch. Tyler let out a quiet, broken laugh. Even now, that sounded so much like William. William shifted a bit on his hospital pillow, but when truth stays buried for too long, it turns destructive. Silence took over the room again as his eyes locked onto the camera, staring directly at us. Ethan, Rachel, Tyler. Hearing their names, all three kids visibly tensed up. Arch. Before it's too late, I need you to understand one thing. William paused to catch his breath, then continued steadily. Your mother was never the weak one in this family. Tears instantly flooded my eyes. Ethan dropped his head, Rachel started weeping quietly beside me, and Tyler stared at the screen without even blinking. William smiled faintly. Arch. When Jones Construction almost went under during the Great Recession, I was terrified. I didn't tell anyone how bad it was because I thought a father had to look invincible. His breath hitched for a second. It was your mother who saved us. Time and time again. An icy chill settled over the room. She made every single sacrifice in silence, just so you could grow up without fear. Arch. I covered my mouth, letting the tears stream down my face, because finally, someone was saying it out loud. Not written in cold legal documents, not hidden in dry accounting ledgers, but spoken publicly with deep affection and emotion. William looked completely exhausted, but he pushed through. For years, I comfortably accepted praise that belonged to both of us. Arch. The honesty in his voice shattered something deep inside me. For decades, I had convinced myself that keeping quiet was enough, that love didn't need to be acknowledged out loud. But hearing William finally admit the truth after all these years was both healing and agonizing. Rachel squeezed my hand tighter. William turned his focus to Ethan first. Arch. Son, you spent your whole life trying so hard to be me. Ethan's jaw instantly tightened. But I need you to realize something. William's voice grew slightly weaker. Success without kindness only leaves you deeply lonely in the end. Ethan closed his eyes. Orch. I've taught you how to value strength, William continued. But your mother taught you loyalty, sacrifice, and empathy. He swallowed with difficulty. And somewhere along the way, I let you get away with believing those qualities were worthless. A tear slipped down Ethan's cheek, and he didn't even wipe it away. William looked back at the camera. That was my failure. Orch. Those words echoed through the conference room. Not your failure, mine. A father taking responsibility. A husband facing the damage caused by his own cowardice. Then William offered a bittersweet smile. Rachel, my beautiful daughter. Rachel broke down completely, covering her mouth as her shoulders shook uncontrollably. You inherited your mother's heart, William whispered. Orch. But you learned to hide it because you were afraid showing softness would make you look weak. Rachel wept even harder. Over the years, I watched you grow distant, cold, and defensive. William said gently, his eyes filled with regret. I should have seen earlier that you were carrying pain, not confidence. Rachel buried her face in her hands. William smiled weakly again. Orch, during your darkest moments, your mother carried you through them. Meanwhile, I was distracted, busy building things that don't even matter now. Aside from Rachel's quiet weeping beside me, the room was dead silent. Then, William turned to Tyler, who immediately looked gripped by fear. Tyler, his voice softened completely. You are the most like me. Tyler took a shaky breath. Orch, that wasn't always a compliment. A faint, tired smile crossed William's face. You feel everything so deeply. That's your greatest strength, but also your biggest danger. Tyler's eyes turned red instantly. I know you think your mistakes define who you are, William went on, but they don't. Tyler stared down at the floor. Orch, your mother didn't save you over and over because she turned a blind eye to your failures. William paused weakly. She did it because a mother always sees the child hidden beneath the mess. Tyler began crying silently, real tears, not drunken anger or self-pity, but pure, deep pain. William leaned back into his hospital pillow, clearly running out of energy. Orch. Then he finally looked straight at me. The entire atmosphere in the room shifted. In his eyes, I saw 43 years of history, love, regret, gratitude, and heartbreak, all spoken without words. Bella. Just hearing that nickname nearly broke me entirely. His gaze turned incredibly soft. I should have protected you better. My vision blurred completely with tears. Orch, you spent a lifetime holding this family up, while I fooled myself into believing that staying quiet kept the peace. His voice cracked heavily. But silence only ends up protecting the selfish ones. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Tears filled William's eyes. I watched you become invisible in your own home. A sob escaped my throat. I couldn't hold it back. Orch. Instead of facing it, I naively thought things would fix themselves. He closed his eyes briefly. My cowardice cost us years we can never get back. Ethan was crying openly now. Rachel leaned against my shoulder, and Tyler looked like a completely broken child. William took another shaky breath. If you're angry after hearing this, he whispered, be angry at me. Hate me too. Orch. The sheer honesty in those words left us feeling helpless because none of us hated William. Even now, after everything, we still loved him, and somehow that made the grief so much heavier to carry. William looked into the camera one last time. I don't know how much time your mother has left with you. His voice trembled. None of us can predict the future. I squeezed my eyes shut. Orch, don't waste time like I did. A dead quiet still hung over the room. Then, through his tears, William gave a faint smile. And Bella, I looked back up at the screen. You were the best thing that ever happened to my life. That sentence completely shattered my last defense. I bent over, burying my face in my hands, weeping openly. Rachel immediately wrapped her arms tight around me. Orch. The video played for a few more seconds. William awkwardly reached his hand toward the lens as if trying to touch us one last time. Then, he whispered softly, take care of each other. The screen went black. For a long time afterward, no one moved. Outside, the city neon lights flickered against the glass, and grief settled heavily over us once again. But this time, the grief felt different, cleaner, and somehow more honest. Finally, Ethan slowly stood up, tears streaming down his face. "I spent my whole life trying to make him proud of me," he whispered, his voice choking up. Rachel looked completely emotionally spent. "He loved you more than anything, Mom." "Yes," I said softly. Tyler wiped his face roughly. "And we made you feel so completely alone." The hard truth of those words echoed painfully through the room. Then, Ethan walked over to me slowly, not as the executive of Jones Construction or William's successor, but simply as my son. He knelt by my chair again, just like before. Rachel held onto my arm tightly, while Tyler stood nearby, tears still running down his cheeks. For the first time since the funeral, I didn't feel invisible anymore. I was still broken, yes. I was still drowning in the pain of losing my husband, absolutely. But I was no longer invisible, because William had finally given a voice to the sacrifices I had buried for decades. And somehow, across the boundary of life and death, my husband was still trying to pull our family back together. Cold winter slowly gave way to early spring. The icy sidewalks of Chicago turned slick under gentle spring rains, and the trees outside the Lake Forest estate began sprouting fresh buds. It was the first spring since William passed. Grief had shifted shape too. It hadn't disappeared, but had grown quieter, less sharp, more like a familiar presence, like learning to live with a dull ache instead of fighting it every single day. 6 months after the funeral, major changes had taken place at Jones Construction, and within our family as well. Victoria Hayes officially accepted an out-of-court settlement. Faced with overwhelming evidence, her legal team had no choice but to negotiate. To avoid prison time, she surrendered all diverted assets, resigned permanently from any role within the company, and vanished completely from our lives. I hadn't seen her in months. Part of me hated what she had done, but another part felt pity for her. Resentment had completely consumed her, causing her to destroy the only family she had left in this world. And in the end, she was left with nothing. On a rainy Tuesday morning, I stood in the company lobby, watching employees prepare for the launch of a new scholarship foundation. Ethan walked toward me holding a stack of folders. "You're early," he said. I offered a gentle smile. "So are you." Moments like this still felt surreal to me. His voice carried a warmth now. That harsh, controlling edge was gone. Our relationship hadn't been fixed overnight through some grand drama. It was rebuilt slowly through small, daily moments. A hot cup of coffee left on my desk, a quick call asking if I slept well, or how Ethan finally started listening during long meetings instead of jumping to conclusions. His transformation was slow, painful, and genuine, which made it all the more meaningful. "What's in the folder?" I asked. He carefully handed one to me. Opening the cover, the title caught my eye, the Isabella Jones Educational Grant Program. I caught my breath instantly, looking up at him. "Ethan." He scratched the back of his neck, looking a bit self-conscious. The board passed it unanimously. I looked back down at the proposal. Funded entirely by the Jones Family Foundation and named in my honor, the grant was designed specifically to support single mothers returning to college. A lump immediately formed in my throat. "You didn't have to do this." "No," Ethan said softly. "I needed to." The deep sincerity in his voice brought tears close to the surface. A few minutes later, Rachel arrived with floral arrangements for the event. Over the past few months, she had poured her energy into running the family foundation, showing a vibrant spark while organizing community outreach that I hadn't seen since her teenage years. The moment she walked in, she came straight over and gave me a big hug, not a polite, cautious embrace, but a completely natural one, just like a daughter hugging her mother. "Are you doing okay?" she asked softly. I nodded quickly before tears could fall. "I'm working on it." Rachel smiled gently. "We all are." Tyler arrived last, looking healthy and clear-eyed. Porch. He had been sober for nearly 6 months now, and seeing the change in him still amazed me. He laughed more easily, spoke at a steadier pace, and truly listened when others talked. The pain hadn't vanished, but the urge to destroy himself no longer controlled his life. He held a small velvet box in his hand, and seeing it made my heart drop instantly. Tyler. He walked over slowly. I found it. Porch. My hands trembled as I opened the box. Resting inside was my mother's gold bracelet, the one I had pawned years ago to save him. I was completely speechless. Tyler managed a faint smile. It took 4 months of tracking down pawnshop records and estate auctions. Tears flooded my eyes. You shouldn't have spent money on this. I didn't buy a piece of jewelry, he said quietly. Porch. I bought back a piece of the life you sacrificed for me. My vision blurred. Rachel started wiping away tears beside us, and even Ethan looked visibly moved. Tyler carefully fastened the bracelet onto my wrist. I can't take back the terrible things I said at the funeral, he whispered, his voice cracking. But I need you to know. I finally understand. Porch. I looked down at the soft gleam of the gold bracelet against my skin. Suddenly, memories rushed back like a tidal wave, vivid enough to take my breath away. My mother putting it on me before my wedding, William kissing the back of my hand when he saw it for the first time, and silently pawning it to save my son. Porch. And now it was back on my wrist. Not because of money, but because love had finally learned to express itself honestly. The scholarship launch began shortly after in the central atrium. Employees gathered quietly, and local media camera crews set up near the stage. I had always disliked public attention. In the past, William handled speeches like this while I preferred working behind the scenes. Porch. But today felt different. It wasn't about seeking recognition, but about honoring the truth. Ethan took the podium first, looking slightly nervous, which surprised me. My father built a remarkable company, he began, choosing words carefully. But today, I want to honor the person who truly held our family together. My throat tightened instantly as Ethan looked straight at me. Porch. For decades, my mother sacrificed in silence while others stood in the spotlight, accepting all the praise. A complete quiet fell over the hall. For a very long time, I failed to see that. His voice trembled slightly. And I can't put into words the regret I feel for it. Rachel lowered her head, weeping softly, while Tyler stood quietly by her side. Porch. Ethan continued, we established this grant because women like Isabella Jones carry their families' dreams and futures on their shoulders without ever asking for applause. Several employees quietly wiped away tears, and an elderly project manager nodded along in silent agreement. Ethan stepped down from the podium and walked straight toward me. Porch. Right in front of everyone, without hesitation or awkwardness, he pulled me into a tight hug. The room broke into warm applause, but all I could hear was my son whispering in my ear. I am so sorry, Mom. Those words healed something deep inside me that had been broken for years. It wasn't perfect, and it didn't instantly erase every scar, but it was enough. Porch. After the event, Rachel drove me home while Tyler followed in his truck. As we pulled into the driveway of the estate, I noticed an unusual package sitting on the front porch. A cardboard box. There's no return address, Rachel said cautiously. I picked up the box slowly. Inside was an old photo album filled with family pictures. William, me, the kids, holidays, birthday parties, camping trips. Porch. Taped inside the front cover was a handwritten note. I'm leaving Chicago. You were right, he chose you. Victoria. I stared at that note for a long time while Rachel watched silently over my shoulder. Finally, she asked softly, what are you going to do with it? Porch. I carefully closed the album, then looked up at the house William and I had built together where we had lived for 40 years. A home shaped by love and silence in equal measure. I think, I whispered, I'm tired of carrying other people's anger. Porch. That night, I slept more peacefully than I had since William passed. Not because every problem was resolved or the grief was gone, but because truth had finally replaced illusion. Sometimes, healing begins the moment people can finally see each other clearly. On the 1-year anniversary of William's passing, we returned to the church where everything had once fallen apart. Only this time, we came back differently. Early spring sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, driving away the cold winter shadows that once hung over the hall. White roses filled the altar, surrounding William's portrait in warm candlelight. The church felt peaceful, warm, and alive. I paused at the entrance for a long moment before walking in. The last time I stepped through those doors, my children had humiliated me beside my husband's casket, leaving my spirit completely hollowed out. I used to think I would never willingly set foot here again, but healing sometimes requires us to revisit the very places where we were broken. Rachel saw me first, her expression softening instantly. "You look beautiful today, Mom." I smiled faintly. "You too." And she truly did. Not because of her dress or makeup, but because the cold edge she carried for years had finally vanished. Tyler was adjusting flower arrangements near the front pews, while Ethan spoke quietly with arriving guests. It was a small, private memorial. Both men looked visibly more mature now, not just physically, but emotionally. Pain has a way of growing people up if you let it. Ethan walked over to me, holding a framed picture carefully in both hands. My heart stopped the moment I saw it. It was the photo Rachel had deliberately removed at the funeral a year ago. William and me in Napa Valley, laughing, happy, and full of life. Ethan swallowed hard. Today, this belongs right at the front. Emotion welled up in my chest as he placed the photo right next to William's portrait in the center of the altar. Not hidden, not set aside, but placed side by side, right where it belonged. Over the next 20 minutes, guests settled into their seats. Jones construction employees, relatives, friends, and recipients of the Isabella Jones Educational Grant. People whose lives William and I had impacted together, standing as one unit rather than separate pieces. That mattered deeply today. The service began to soft piano music. There was no tension, no hushed rumors, no shame, just memories. Ethan stepped up to the podium first. For a moment, he simply looked down at his notes before looking up at me. "My father spent his life building things," he said softly. "Buildings, companies, business opportunities." The church was dead quiet. "But the strongest thing he ever built was our family." His voice shook slightly. "And a year ago, I almost destroyed it with my own hands because I foolishly confused sacrifice with visibility." I lowered my eyes immediately as emotion surged through my chest. Ethan continued, "My mother loved quietly for decades, while we gave all our praise to those who spoke louder." Several guests nodded gently. She carried burdens none of us noticed until it was almost too late. His eyes turned red. "At my father's funeral, instead of honoring her, I humiliated her publicly because—" He choked up, unable to go on. Rachel stepped up to take his place, unfolding a small slip of paper with trembling hands. "I used to think being strong meant never needing anyone," she whispered. "But my mother taught me that strength sometimes means staying gentle in a world that rewards coldness." I closed my eyes briefly. Rachel offered a tearful, bittersweet smile. "During the darkest moments of my life, when shame made it hard to keep going, my mother protected me." A few people in the audience began wiping away tears. "And instead of thanking her, I judged her." Her voice cracked completely. "I thought she was weak simply because she never claimed credit." Rachel looked straight at me now. "But I understand now." A profound silence settled over the room. The person carrying the whole family on her shoulders rarely has time to announce how heavy the load actually is. I couldn't hold it back anymore. A sob escaped my throat. And Rachel wept openly too. "I'm so sorry, Mom." That apology echoed gently through the church, unfiltered, unperformed, and deeply real. Finally, Tyler stood up. He looked visibly nervous. It was his first time speaking publicly while completely sober in years, but he stayed grounded. "My dad saved my life more than once," he began steadily. "But my mother never stopped saving me." His voice trembled. "Even when I gave her every reason to give up on me." I thought back to the calls from the facility, the gold bracelet, the funeral, porch, and all those long years we weathered together. Tyler wiped his tears roughly. At the funeral, I said something unforgivable. The room was still. I told my mom she was just living off what my dad built. His voice cracked entirely. The truth is, all of us survived on her love all these years. The quiet that followed felt almost sacred. Porch. Healing voices are often so much softer than painful ones. Tyler stepped down quickly before completely losing composure. Then, the pastor invited me to step forward. I almost declined. I had always feared public speaking, and William was always better at handling crowds. But this moment wasn't about performance. It was strictly about truth. Porch. So I walked slowly toward the altar, toward my husband's picture, toward the children who had once made me feel invisible, and toward a family slowly finding its way back together. I looked at William's smiling portrait, paused for a few seconds, and spoke. "Your father loved us all deeply," my voice echoed softly through the church. "He wasn't perfect." Porch. A few light chuckles rippled through the congregation. He was a workaholic, he avoided uncomfortable conversations, and he naively believed silence could keep the peace. I offered a sad smile. But he loved deeply. I looked at my children, and so do I. Tears filled all three of their eyes instantly. Porch. Over the past year, there were moments I doubted our family could survive the truth. I paused carefully. But the reality was, lies were already destroying us. The church remained still. The truth hurt us deeply, I whispered, but it also gave us a chance to heal. Porch. I looked down at the gold bracelet gleaming softly in the light. The bracelet I had pawned to save my son, which had somehow miraculously found its way back to me. Just like us. Finally, I looked straight at my children. "I forgive you." Rachel broke into uncontrollable tears, Tyler covered his face, and Ethan closed his eyes as if those words released a heavy weight from his shoulders. "Porch," I continued gently, "not because the past pain doesn't matter. No one moved in the room, but because carrying love forward is so much lighter than carrying resentment." Tears ran freely down my face. "Your father spent his whole life trying to bring us back to each other." I turned toward William's portrait one last time, offering a gentle smile through my tears. Porch. For the first time since he passed, that smile felt entirely real. After the service, my children gathered around me outside under the warm spring sun. Not out of obligation, but out of love. As we stood there talking softly through our tears, I realized something beautiful. A family doesn't break in a single moment, and it certainly doesn't heal in one either. Porch. Healing happens slowly. One truth at a time, one choice at a time, one act of love at a time. And after so many years of silence, we were finally choosing each other again. After losing my husband, I thought the hardest thing I would ever face was grief. I was wrong. The hardest thing was realizing how invisible I had become within my own family. Porch. For years, I believed love meant sacrificing in silence without expecting anything back, that keeping quiet preserved peace, and that if I gave, endured, and forgiven enough, everyone would eventually understand my heart without me saying a word. But silence can turn toxic, especially within a family.